Standing up to the giants is a daunting task. Just imagine being David, and from all physical odds, going up against a giant, and it would seem that you would surely be defeated. But David defied all odds from a physical perspective and defeated Goliath. And today, you and I should be as courageous and faithful as David to face our giants, trusting that God will deliver us to victory, no matter what the physical odds may look like. However, the reality is that most times, the giants win in our world. Maybe you're talking physically, and the giants, so-called, seem to win more often than not when it comes to sporting events, when the bigger, better-funded teams and such beat the smaller and less funded teams. Or the same could be said about with war or even in business. But certainly, most times the giants win on a spiritual level. Most times, the one who is in addiction doesn't get out of addiction. Most times, the one who struggles and is enslaved by depression doesn't get out of it. Most time, the one who is focused on worldliness stays focused on worldliness. Or the one who is controlled by fear stays that way. Or the one who is stuck in his or her comfort zone doesn't get out of it. Or the one who is complacent in serving God stays complacent in serving God. And the list could go on and on. Now, we're going to be exploring throughout the series that, of course, this doesn't have to be the case, and certainly this doesn't have to be the case spiritually, and we'll see that as we keep going. We already know that to be true as it relates to David, but you need to recognize that the giants beat most people, and they will defeat you unless you do the things we'll be discussing throughout this series. So take this lesson as a sort of warning for all of us. For while people all over this world want to beat their giants, right? David didn't just win against Goliath because he wanted to beat Goliath. In fact, you think about how most of the Israelites wanted to beat Goliath. While people all over this world want to beat their giants, they often don't for various reasons. So the purpose of this lesson is to learn how Satan is successful in using giants to defeat most people by considering that Goliath almost won against Israel and why many will be defeated by giants today. Again, take this lesson not as a discouragement, but as a dose of reality and as a warning that we must do something different if we want to truly defeat our giants. So let's spend some time thinking about the Israelites when David had went up against Goliath in battle. You see, Goliath almost won by default, I think we can say. I want you to step back and I want you to appreciate as we look into the text and remember the story from David and Goliath, that Goliath's challenge went unanswered. Picture the scene there at the battlefront. You've got the Philistine army and their champion warrior on one hill, and you've got Israel on the other. Now, I want you to remember the description of Goliath as well. Remember, here's this champion that emerges who is approximately 9 feet, 9 inches tall, and he's got all this armor that's described and is very impressive to think about. He's got a shield bearer, he's got a spear, right? All these different things that it describes to us. And just picture that scene. And now Israel on the other side, on the other hill. And then you've got the challenge that was given. 1 Samuel chapter 17, verses 8 through 10. He stood and shouted to the Israelite battle formations, "Why do you come out to line up in battle formation?" he asked them. "Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose one of your men and have him come down against me. If he wins in a fight against me and kills me, we will be your servants. But if I win against him and kill him, then you will be our servants and serve us." Then the Philistine said, "I defy the ranks of Israel today. Send me a man so we can fight each other." So here's this challenge that is being given to the Israelites. Now, the Israelites should have remembered that God had promised to be with them. If they would be on God's side, God would be with them, God would fight for them, and no one would be able to defeat them. But yet, even though they should have remembered those things, no one stood up to fight Goliath. In 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 16, every morning and every evening for 40 days, the Philistine came forward and took his stand. Think about it. For 40 days, morning and evening, every person in the Israelite army made a decision. Every person in the Israelite army decided for 40 days, twice a day, not to go up against the giant. And this is the point that David enters the story. And David hears the challenge. And he appears to do on the very first day what the entire army had failed to do for 40 days. And you step back and you think about that, as impressive as that is, and you question, how long would Goliath's challenge have went unanswered without David? You see, Goliath and his challenge went unanswered. Only David was willing to answer it. So we could say that Goliath defeated every other Israelite. Think about King Saul, for example. You just go down the list and you think about how Goliath defeated all the Israelites. Think about, for example, a few particular ones that the story tells us about. And of course, we think about King Saul. We talked about him a little bit in lesson number 1. Think about how he was a head taller than the rest of the Israelites, generally speaking. And he had armor, and he had a sword, and he should have had faith to go against Goliath even when others did not. However, he did not. Instead, all he did was offer a reward to the one who defeated Goliath and the use of his armor and sword. And you just think about that. He evidently thought that would be sufficient for somebody else, but not for him. Next, King Saul's not the only one that we know of by name who was at the battle who Goliath defeated. Think about Abner. He's the commander of the army. Abner had heard Goliath's challenge, and he did not answer it. And he watched David fight alongside King Saul. Look at 1 Samuel 17, verse 55. You read about Abner there, how when King Saul had seen David going out to confront the Philistine, he asked Abner, the commander of the army. All right, so both of them are there. They're watching David go fight, but they're not fighting. And then I want you to think about David's 3 oldest brothers. In 1 Samuel 17, verses 12 through 14, it talks about how the 3 oldest of Jesse's sons, or David's brothers, had followed Saul to the war: Eliab, Abinadab, and Shammah. David is the youngest brother. And so here's David's 3 older brothers who are out there at the battle. They were all present. They heard Goliath's challenge, but they did not volunteer. And in fact, as you read through the text, the oldest brother was even upset at David for coming in verse 28. So these are some specific ones that we know were at the battle. These are specific ones that we can then conclude that they chose not to fight against Goliath, that Goliath defeated those individuals. And the same is true for every person in the Israelite army. Goliath can be said to have defeated all of these, not because they fought and they lost, but I think we can say that he defeated all of these by default because they had all basically forfeited. You think about when somebody is the champion, and the champion challenges somebody to take him on. Well, the champion remains the champion when no one steps up to challenge him. And that's what the entire Israelite army had done. And so Goliath had defeated every other Israelite, at least by default. And then we need to recognize that the entire Israelite army then retreated from Goliath. I want you to look with me in 1 Samuel 17 and in verse 11. It says, "When Saul and all Israel heard these words from the Philistine, they lost their courage and were terrified." Now, maybe we'd understand this reaction the first time seeing the giant. This is pretty impressive looking individual. It's very intimidating to think about. But you would have hoped that things changed during the 40 mornings and evenings of hearing the challenge. Hopefully somebody in the camp, led by King Saul, or maybe it's Abner, or somebody even within the Israelite army itself would have said, you know what, God's on our side, and we can do this. We can defeat this champion Goliath. But they didn't. It continued 40 mornings and evenings. But no one trusted enough in God to volunteer to fight. Instead, this same cowardly response continued whenever David arrived. Look in 1 Samuel 17, verses 20 through 24, as David's father told him to go to see how his brothers were doing and sent some provisions. So David got up early in the morning, left the flock with someone to keep it, loaded up, and set out as Jesse had charged him. He arrived at the perimeter of the camp as the army was marching out to its battle formation, shouting their battle cry. Israel and the Philistines lined up in battle formation, facing each other. David left his supplies in the care of the quartermaster and ran to the battle line. When he arrived, he asked his brothers how they were. While he was speaking with them, suddenly the champion named Goliath, the Philistine from Gath, came forward from the Philistine battle line and shouted his usual words, which David heard. When all the Israelite men saw Goliath, they retreated from him terrified. So it's not just on day one when they first hear this battle cry, when they first see Goliath. It's now these many days later when David comes, and the Israelites are still doing the same thing. Now, it's interesting to me, apparently the Israelite army continued going through the motions over these 40 days. Notice they're still coming and they're still shouting their battle cry, and then retreating after Goliath's challenge in terror. And you think about that. So their battle cry, we could say, was all talk and no action as it related to actually fighting the giant. No person was willing to fight him in battle. That is, no person until David came. When David heard this challenge and saw the response of the Israelite army, he began answering the challenge. He put things into motion to try to take whatever steps needed to be done relatively quickly. Yet before we focus on how David defeated Goliath throughout this series, which we'll be doing, I want you to recognize very carefully that Goliath won on most days and against most people. That David was the exception. And so, of course, throughout this study, we're going to be looking to David and looking at his example and looking at how he defeated the giant. But yet we also need to recognize on this other side of things that if it hadn't been for David stepping up and defeating the giant, that most were defeated by him. Again, at least by default. So as we start making applications today, we can also conclude by our own observations, and we can even look in our own lives, and we can see that perhaps this has been true at different times in our lives, that most people today are defeated by the various giants of life. And we talked about different examples of giants in the first lesson, and you can evaluate your own giants and so forth. But most people are defeated. Why? Well, let's look at some reasons. Number one, most choose the easy path. Going up against the giants, that's not the easy path in the sense of what feels easiest to us, and that's not intimidating to us. Most people will be defeated by Satan and experience an eternal destruction in hell because they're not obedient to God. Jesus tells us that. That's not my opinion or the opinion of someone else. That is Jesus in Matthew chapter 7, verses 13 and 14. It says, "Enter through the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the road broad that leads to destruction. And there are many who go through it. How narrow is the gate and difficult the road that leads to life, and few find it." Now, one of the themes that we see consistently throughout the pages of the Bible is that there are few who faithfully follow God. It's here in this passage, and it's in other places as well. And just historically, I mean, even think back to David and Goliath. There were few who wanted to go or who volunteered to go against Goliath. In fact, so few was only the one. Jesus said, why few will follow, why few will find life, is because the narrow path God wants us to walk on, it's difficult. It's simply easier in some respects. Now, in many respects, it makes our life much harder in the long term. But it is easier, or it seems easier, not to live for God. For example, think about if you don't live for God and you don't fight the giants, you don't have to trust in anything or anyone besides what you see, what you want to trust in. You can live however you want. You can do whatever pleases yourself. You don't have to push yourself more than you want to. You don't have to deny yourself. You can believe whatever you want to believe, and you'll fit in with people in this world. So, it's the easier path in that sense, and most people will choose that path. And in doing so, they never have to fight against the giants if they don't want to, unless it's something that they just really don't want in their lives. But they don't have to fight against their giants. They can just let the giants defeat them. They can just ignore the giants and go about their way. Or they can make excuses for the giants and why the giants are in their lives. Or they can even join forces with the giants and accomplish that mission. Now, this is not just people who have no religious affiliation and who would never profess to follow Jesus. Instead, Jesus goes on and demonstrates how this is true with many people who profess to follow him. In Matthew 7, verses 21 to 23, it's not just all of those that go on that broad way, that easy way. Instead, Matthew 7, verses 21 to 23 says, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father in heaven. On that day, many will say to me, 'Lord, Lord, didn't we prophesy in your name and drive out demons in your name and do many miracles in your name?' Then I will announce to them, 'I never knew you. Depart from me, you lawbreakers.'" Today, there are even many religious people who are like this, who are taking the easy path. They may believe in Jesus. They may say they have faith in Jesus and that he is their Lord, but they're really not doing the will of God. Like the Israelites, right? They profess to be God's people and believe in God, but yet they wouldn't go up against the giants. Many people choose to take the easy path, and so the giants win. Another reason why most are defeated by the giants is that many focus on physical things. And this was almost certainly a reason the Israelites did not defeat Goliath before David. Certainly nobody in Israel matched up physically. We've talked about how Saul was a tall man in Israel, but very short compared to the giant. Nobody in Israel matched up. So from a physical perspective, this did not look like a good fight. Today, when people face their giants, A lot of times they continue focusing on physical things and may only see, maybe it's the fun and pleasure a giant offers. For example, they see the pleasure of drugs or sex or a worldly possession or a friendship or whatever. Or they see from a physical perspective how difficult a giant will be to defeat. Right? They see how hard it is to overcome an addiction. Or they see how hard it is to change an addiction or whatever. They may get lost even in the despair of looking at a physical situation and see no way to have a better life on this earth besides what physical things offer. They may just think that this is it. This is the best I can do. But I want you to think about how Jesus' parable of the sower demonstrates how physical things keep people from following Jesus and defeating their giants. I want you to look with me in Mark chapter 4, and let's read in verses 3 through 8. It says, "Listen, consider the sower who went out to sow. As he sowed, some seed fell along the path, and the birds came and devoured it. Other seed fell on rocky ground where it didn't have much soil, and it grew up quickly since the soil wasn't deep. When the sun came up, it was scorched, and since it had no root, it withered away. Other seed fell among thorns, and the thorns came up, choked it, and it didn't produce fruit. Still other seed fell on good ground, and it grew up, producing fruit that increased 30, 60, and 100 times." And then Jesus explains that parable, starting in verse 14. "The sower sows the word, and some are like the word sown on the path. When they hear, immediately Satan comes and takes away the word sown in them. And others are like seed sown on rocky ground. When they hear the word, immediately they receive it with joy, but they have no root. They are short-lived. When distress or persecution comes because of the word, they immediately fall away. Others are like seed sown among thorns. These are the ones who hear the word, but the worries of this age, the deceitfulness of wealth, and the desires for other things enter in and choke the word, and it becomes unfruitful. And those like seed sown on good ground hear the word, welcome it, and produce fruit 30, 60, and 100 times what was sown." I want you to notice there are 3 categories of people in this parable who do not live as God desires because they are focused on physical things. The first 3. All right, the soil along the path is just too focused on the worldly things to pay attention to God's word and give it a chance. And that's like most people. They're just too consumed by the things of this life, and the giants have no problem defeating those individuals. The rocky soil maybe first accepts God's word, but they get intimidated by the physical threats of persecution or distress for following Jesus. This is going to be difficult. And so they don't continue to follow the Lord, and the giants can defeat them. And then the thorny soil gets distracted by the worries of earthly life, the deceitfulness of earthly wealth, and the desires for earthly things. So they just get consumed, carried away by the physical things of this life and desires and various things that they face. And most people are described by these 3 types of soil and will be defeated by their giants, not because they can't defeat the giants, but because they're focused on physical things. Few will be like the good soil and carefully cultivate the fruit of living for God. But next, as we continue thinking about why most are defeated by the giants, is that many do not even try. You know, the Bible never records anyone besides David even trying to fight against Goliath. And you think about it again, as we talked about, right? Goliath won by default against them because most of them never tried. Today, many live with their giants challenging them every day. Think about the Israelites. They heard it every day, twice a day, and they didn't even try. And today, the same thing happens. People live with their giants challenging them every day, and they retreat from them rather than mustering up the faith and the courage to try to defeat them. Instead, they just learned to live with the giants. Now, you think about why don't they try? Well, some don't try because they don't know what they should do. Maybe that was true with the Israelites. Maybe they really didn't know what they ought to do to go and defeat this Goliath. Some don't try because they're afraid of failing. For example, in 1 Samuel 17 and verse 11, right, they lost courage. They were terrified. Same thing there in verse 24 as we saw. Right, they're afraid of failing. They know the consequences, life and death, slavery for the nation, all of those things. And so evidently they concluded that it was better not to try than to try and to fail. Some don't even try because they don't think anything's wrong. It's interesting how you can be in a situation and be enslaved in these ways to whatever it may be, to have these giants who manipulate your life in different ways, and then you're just used to it. And you don't think anything's wrong. Just accept the giants as a part of our lives, and we make excuses for them. Oh, that's just how I am, or whatever. I've done this for a long time, or whatever. But yet, if you desire to defeat your giants and be victorious in the war for your soul, you must choose to fight against Satan and the giants. You've got to try. You've got to do what you can. James 1 verse 22, if we want to live to please God, he says, but be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. You can't just hear God's word and then not put it into action. You can't know that you've got a giant in your life that God wants you to confront and you don't confront it. Verses 26 and 27 goes on, if anyone thinks he is religious without controlling his tongue, his religion is useless and he deceives himself. Pure and undefiled religion before God the Father is this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself unstained from the world. Although you may deceive yourself into thinking the giants are okay, it's not that big a deal if they're in your life. You're not okay if you're not obeying God. You can't deceive yourself. You mustn't deceive yourself. You must try. And you can succeed when you do it God's way. Next, most are defeated by the giants because many give up. Sometimes people do begin to fight against their giants. But then one of two things happen. First, some begin to fight, and then they lose faith somewhere during the battle. When the battle gets tough and requires difficult sacrifices, many retreat and let the giants win. Think, wow, this isn't what I signed up for. I started, but this went further than I was willing to go. But Jesus tells us to count the cost and to recognize that following him costs everything, that everything gets sacrificed to him. Luke 14, verses 25 to 33. So some fail as they begin to fight because they don't use the right weapons and armor. They bring the wrong things to fight with. They equip themselves in the wrong way. And then they depend on their own human wisdom. Think about the kinds of things that many people bring to the fight, and then when they fight the giants using those things, they've got to flee because they're not ready. And sometimes these are self-help books. Maybe it's counseling based on earthly things, or even medication. And we come into our battles against the giants equipped with those things and earthly wisdom, as opposed to the things that really will help us succeed against the giants. Now, that's not to say that you can't use any of those things in your fight, but that will not fully equip you for the battle. We've got to fight God's way. Second, some begin to fight and then quit when things seem good enough. You think about the Israelites. They come into the Canaan land. They were to drive everybody out, destroy those who lived there. But they failed oftentimes to do that. They got good enough, I guess, in their minds, perhaps. And here we are again, right? They've got a battle on their hands, in part because they had failed to do what they were supposed to. So failing to finish off the giants, when we get to a place where we feel like we've got it good enough, results in the giants just sleeping in our lives and waiting for the right opportunity to strike again. So rather than doing that, though, you must not get tired of doing good. Galatians 6, verse 9, let us not get tired of doing good, for we will reap at the proper time if we don't give up. So even when the battle rages for a long time and you become discouraged, don't give up. For whatever reason, do not give up. Many do. But then finally, why are most defeated by the giants? Simply because most do not have faith. Ultimately, the entire issue of fighting against the giants comes down to faith in God. We'll talk more about that as we go through this study. For while most get lost in the physical challenge that Goliath presented, David saw the same challenge. There was nothing different about the challenge between how Goliath challenged the rest of the Israelites and how Goliath challenged David. Nothing different about it. But the Israelites saw the challenge through a physically focused lens, while David saw the challenge through the eyes of faith. And that makes all the difference. Today, many people focus on their own inability to win their battles against the giants. But while we cannot defeat all the giants by ourselves through physical means, we can defeat them through faith in God and Jesus Christ. Philippians 4, verse 13, Paul says, I am able to do all things through him who strengthens me. We can absolutely defeat the giants through Jesus. 1 Corinthians 10, verse 13, no temptation has come upon you except what is common to humanity, but God is faithful. He will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation he will also provide a way out so that you may be able to bear it. You can bear it. You can endure. You can be victorious through Jesus. When people only view things from a physical perspective, fear and earthly challenges are all they see. But when people view every situation through faith in God, the possibilities are endless. 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 7 says, for we walk by faith, not by sight. That's how we need to live and how we must live if we're going to defeat our giants. The one true God is certainly bigger, stronger, and wiser than any of the giants that we face. So in conclusion, most times the giants win. This was true with the Israelites before David arrived, and it is true today. But it doesn't have to be this way. While we have learned an important warning that we can easily be defeated by the giants, we'll now begin focusing on how we can defeat the giants. We don't have to be like most. However, take a moment and consider whether the giants are winning in your life right now, or whether you are defeating them through Jesus Christ.